Hi everyone, welcome to week 11 where we enter this last stretch of the semester, and to celebrate the occasion I thought I'd bring back an old favorite, my little demon wig. I don't know if it's your favorite, nobody really says anything about this, but it's one of my favorites, so hey, you're free to leave comments about the hats or the wigs or whatever silliness I get up to. So this week's topic: gender, sex, and sexuality, and this is another one of those topics. I mean, I like all our topics, right? But you know that. But this is one of these topics where if we had more time in class, in person, in a regular class context, we can get into kind of more elaborate discussions of this topic. It's something that, well, like all our topics, affects everyone in one way or another, and it's really fascinating to get into this topic. So we'll do what we can here. As usual, this set of slides is kind of meant to guide you through the parts of the textbook chapter in question. We can't cover everything that's in that chapter. And in this chapter in particular, what the authors, chapter 11, coincidentally, same as our week, What Can Anthropology Teach Us About Sex, Gender, and Sexuality, they kind of give a lot of ethnographic examples. They go like in more so than in the other chapters, I find, where they'll talk a little bit about some terminology that you can find in anthropology and in related disciplines, and then they kind of give some kind of pretty in-depth cross-cultural ethnographic snippets. So that's quite interesting. Some of you have been saying, oh, the chapters are long. Again, I remind you that we're not seeing each other in class, so the time we're not in class is the time you can devote to this. That said, I understand that not everybody, it's not easy for everybody to read these long things. So what you can do is you can have the PowerPoint open and kind of use it as a guide through the chapter in terms of what you should pay attention to, and in terms of what's going to be on the weekly little quiz. And it doesn't mean you can't read the other stuff. It can help enlighten and elaborate on some of these concepts here, but again, we can't cover everything here. So there we go. There's my disclaimer for the week. So let's get into it. First, I want to, I had this slide in last week's material, and this is a reminder that this sequence here, these next few weeks, where everything that we're talking about kind of falls under this umbrella of social organization, and which are the authors of our textbook define in this way here: patterning of human interdependence in a given society through the actions and decisions of its members. So here, really everything that humans do as a society in terms of how they last week's topic, right, about economic systems, how they divide labor, how they distribute resources, how they use the resources. A future topic, I think not next week, the week after, we'll be talking about political systems. How does a society organize power and decision making? Next week's topic, kinship, so family and marriage. How do people organize their family relations? And this week, gender and sexuality has a lot to do with all of these things, right? They're all interconnected. Remember the holistic perspective? Everything is interconnected. Gender and sexuality in particular just kind of permeates all these other things in different ways. Again, we'd be able to get into more depth on how that works if we had more time together. And of course, another future topic, social stratification, right? How are people put into categories and ranked, or not, right? Because that doesn't happen in every single society in the world. So, that said, gender, sex, and sexuality in cultural anthropology. Dun 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 dun. So, one of the first things that they discuss in this chapter is how anthropology itself, in terms of, things have changed in terms of how these topics are dealt with in cultural anthropology specifically. We've kind of talked a bit about this when we talked about archaeology, for example, and we talked about some of the biases in archaeological research in terms of how archaeologists from, say, the 20th century, who were working very much on a Western, mostly white, North American and European mentality, and they kind of brought that with them, and that biased a lot of their interpretations. Cultural anthropologists have not been immune to that. Basically, no field, even the hard sciences, are not immune to this, by the way. No matter what your chemistry or physics teachers say, everybody's biased in some way or another, and it's kind of impossible to completely eliminate that. But we can definitely observe if ever you go into anthropology, and of course you're going to have to read some of these classics from, say, the 30s, 40s, 50s. Have fun. Been there, done that. And you can observe with this critical lens, like, oh yeah, everything is very male centered. So definitely, like in the early decades of anthropology, up until say the 60s and 70s, and even up until today, it hasn't completely disappeared. There's this Western male bias. So not just male bias, not just Western bias, Western male bias specifically, so that things were interpreted through a lens similar to when we talk about ethnocentrism. Everything was interpreted through a certain lens, and in this case, it was the lens of that kind of privileged Westerners, for one thing, and males within Western society and globally. So with that came, and how that manifests, for example, is assumptions of universal patriarchy, which, as the textbook discuss, loosely means domination by men. And in the textbook, they say domination of women and children by men. I would extend that to attempts at domination between men, right? Because patriarchy is like kind of the rule of the father, right? So in these kinds of systems, not only is there some dominance given to men over women and children, but also men try to kind of dominate each other. So, and even today you have people who argue it. Like, you read some stuff by evolutionary psychologists and sociobiologists. Unfortunately, sometimes they fall into this trap of assuming that patriarchy is somehow universal. And in anthropology, when we say something is universal, we mean that it exists in all cultures, and it has existed in all cultures over time. Right? And so this assumption that patriarchy is universal is actually pretty dangerous, because when people believe that, then they think that there's something somehow natural about male dominance. And as we discussed, even when we talked about primatology, those assumptions are not actually based in anything but people's assumptions, because they'll look at non-human primates and non-human animals and often, again, interpret what they're doing according to a certain lens, right? So what that looks like then is that sometimes, well, not sometimes, but often in early anthropology, there were essentialist ideas about gender norms, roles, and identities. And we'll talk about what we mean by essentialism in another slide. Assumptions of universal homophobia, which we'll also talk about in this set of slides, a few slides down the line. So when you assume that patriarchy is something that has existed in all societies over time, and it makes you think it's somehow natural, right? Which, again, is not. There's no basis in science there. So the in cultural anthropology specifically, what that winds up looking like, how that winds up translating into the research that's been done, is that cultural anthropologists do something called, ethnographic work, which we talked about this way back when, you might not remember. But ethnographic research is when you are in a community, in a culture. It could be your own, it could be another, an unfamiliar one, but you're learning about the way of life, you're documenting things, you're asking questions, you're living life with people and kind of participating and observing at the same time, which is called participant observation. So ethnographers, which are cultural anthropologists who do this kind of field work, they'll, they would, even if they were women, often they would use Western patriarchal frameworks to interpret what was going on in their research. So, for example, they might focus on the words and activities of male informants and not really pay much attention to what the women in the community were doing or saying, right? So there was an assumption again that whatever men had to say in a society was representative of the global opinion. By the way, that's called hegemony, right? When you have this one point of view that's centered and is seen to be the ultimate truth. So, and again, even early women anthropologists would do this because they were raised in that same kind of patriarchal society. So, and then also just assuming that so sometimes ethnographers would go into a society where, say, ceremonial activity was a very important part of life, well, then often they would say, oh, look, in this society, women and men don't do much together, because there are societies where women and men pretty much live their lives separately a lot of the time. And then they would go see what the men were doing in their ceremonial activities and assume that because women couldn't go to these things, well, women were somehow oppressed. And they wouldn't take into consideration that women were doing their thing, and they saw that as equally as important, if not more important, than what the men were doing. And men were excluded from that too. But nobody was making the assumption that men were being oppressed here, right? So again, using this kind of Western framework and making assumptions about what things mean. And so that's ethnocentric on top of having this kind of Western male bias. And, we can also talk, I'm going a bit beyond here in terms of what the textbook talks about, but was one of my interests early on in my anthropological career, and it's always something that I've, kept up with and just... So there's also, and like in all fields, sexism in academia, and here we're talking about the systemic, not just the personal sense, right? So anthropology has not been immune, just like any other scholarly field or any field really, to sexism, which again, when we distinguish between systemic and personal, sexism isn't just about some people having negative attitudes and practicing discrimination and calling people names. That's personal sexism or racism or any kind of bigotry, right? But when it's systemic, that means it's kind of in the rules and regulations, not necessarily overtly, but just in the way things are set up. For example, in universities, to get tenure, you have to have a certain track record in terms of research and stuff. And if you take a break in that, then that's seen as an interruption and you're not seen as productive. And so women, for example, who, again, in the West, often are the ones who have to take more time off if they have a kid, well, then they would have these interruptions, and then the academy wouldn't kind of take account of the fact that, well, they were on break to raise a kid, this is important, then we don't have to kind of consider that as not being productive. They're very productive at that time, right? So, again, sexism has permeated academia and the field of anthropology, therefore, just like any other field. So, feminist anthropology. So here I want to, really start by saying, because sometimes people recoil at the word feminism, not just men. Sometimes people are like, I'm not a feminist, feminism is bad, and people still, all these decades later, have a lot of misconceptions about what feminist means, and a lot of people assume that it means that it's a movement to elevate women above men. It's never really been about that, other than maybe your occasional fringe group, but for the most part, feminism has been about equality and equity. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't problems within feminism, and that's discussed at some point, but how the feminist movement, for example, in North America has been very white-dominated, so that women who are from racialized groups, or classism as well, like feminism has been very white middle class, so working class white women, women who weren't white, so black women, indigenous women, Asian women, other racialized women, didn't necessarily have the same priorities as white middle class feminists. So there are problems, obviously, like with any other social justice movement, right? But at its base, feminism is meant, it's designed to kind of level the playing field. So it's not about bringing women up and reversing the roles of dominance. So in anthropology, what that has looked like then is questioning those essentializing assumptions we talked about before, where you assume things are kind of baked into humans in a certain way. And again, we'll talk more about what essentialism is. So those assumptions that we talked about before, feminist anthropology led a lot of anthropologists, not just women anthropologists, all right? Anthropologists of all genders, to kind of question and dig in. It's like, why are we making these assumptions? And there was a focus on, like we said before, there had been a tendency to focus on men's words and activities in, say, an ethnographic study. Well, then there was like, okay, well, let's see what the women have to say. And even if they're contradicting male points of view in a certain society, doesn't make them invalid. They're just different points of view. there started to be more questions in anthropology. We're talking about, like, say, the 70s and onwards here, right, with the influence of feminist anthropology. You start having more questions about worldviews about gender, sex, and sexuality in cross-cultural perspectives, which again helps get away from these ideas that the Western view is somehow universal. And related to what we're saying in terms of sexism in the professional world, then there starts to be an active denunciation of sexism, homophobia, transphobia in academia and in society. Just like with anthropology associations, for example, all over the place have been denouncing other kinds of discrimination like racism. And this is because more and more anthropologists are seeing, just like in some of the earlier chapters of the textbook, where there's more of a focus now on anthropology, not just for the sake of gathering knowledge, but to make it useful to society. And anthropologists, with the knowledge that anthropologists have based on, cross-cultural knowledge, there's really a lot we can say. It's like, look, there's no scientific backup for all these forms of discrimination. Right? So a lot of anthropologists have, because of the influence of feminist anthropology, have been better equipped to stand up against different kinds of sexism and homophobia, transphobia, and other kinds of discrimination, both within the professional world, but like in wider society. So I keep using this word essentializing, essentialist, essentialism. What the heck am I talking about? Essentially. See what I did there? So when we're talking about gender essentialism, and this is my wording, you might see different ways of expressing this, but what it boils down to, in my experience, is that essentialism winds up being the idea that one's gender identity or gender expression, gender roles, right, everything that has to do with gender, emerge directly from a person's biological makeup. Okay, phrases that I've heard in the past, or like anatomy is destiny. So if you're born in a quote unquote woman's body, that leads directly to a certain gender, right? So it's similar to the idea of biological determinism. So basically, the body that you have, including your genes and all this kind of stuff, your anatomy, what secondary sexual characteristics you have, that's where your gender comes from. And this, of course, permeates society. We still see it, like, have gender reveal parties. Like, people think they know a baby's gender just based on an ultrasound. And what kind of body does this person have, right? So it's permeates the way in which babies are even assigned a gender at birth. Now, every society has their way of doing this, but some have more flexibility than others, and we'll see that. Okay, so often gender essentialism is based on faulty ideas about evolution, and you still hear this discourse a lot from sociobiologists, evolutionary psychologists, the right wing will come up with these things about how, well, women are the way they are because of millions of years of evolution, and millions of years ago, women and men were hardwired a certain way because of their roles, and how men would go and hunt and women would stay home and clean the cave and take care of the babies. And we kind of, again, because we're online and it's asynchronous, we don't have time to go in depth, but I've mentioned a number of times that there's, like, archaeology has disproved a lot of those things, right? So early human societies were a lot more collaborative than people think. Both women and men contributed enormously to survival. People tended to move around, so they tended to keep their populations low. Women weren't popping out babies every year. Okay, so these ideas have been disproven, and yet people still are stuck in this mindset sometimes of like, well, no, like women are like this and men are like that. You have these two boxes and they're completely different, and there is no other way. And of course the logic there fails too, because we know evolution means change over time. So even if it was true that millions of times, and it isn't, but let's say it was, that millions of years ago things were a certain way everywhere in the world, which again doesn't make sense. Different environments, people are going to do different things. Evolution has happened and changes happen. So, it's really, people forget that sometimes. So what anthropologists advocate then is this idea of the cultural construction of gender. Now, I often hear big reactions to this because then sometimes people go, oh, you're going to the other extreme and you're assuming that our bodies have nothing to do with gender. And that's not quite what cultural construction of gender means. Okay? Sometimes you might hear social construction of gender. And by the way, if you remember the week before the break, I think it was 2-3 weeks before the break, when we talked about the social construction of race and how these racial categories were created based on a certain interpretation of human variation, which is faulty and not based in science. It's the same thing. Gender essentialism is kind of like race ideology, where you think you can categorize people a certain way because of how their bodies are. Okay? And it doesn't take account into actual science behind all of this. So whereas the social construction of race or the cultural construction of gender acknowledges that different cultures, every culture in the world has its own way of interpreting biology and nature. Okay, so part of that is that you probably, if you took any sociology, any psychology, you've probably heard this over and over again. This distinction between sex and gender, right? Where sex is one's biological characteristics, your genital configuration, your chromosomes, all this stuff, and gender is more the cultural and social expectations that are given to you, right? And even that, there are some arguments, and we don't have time to really go into it. We'll touch on it a bit later, but even that category of sex is called into question because biologically we're more on a spectrum than in two boxes. Okay, so it's hard to conceive of when you're raised to think about the sexes as two separate boxes, but they're not really. So there's some people will talk about, especially like in trans communities, where there's a psychological aspect of gender, and you could say that's the psychological aspect, is how you feel about it, is somewhat at the intersection between biology and culture, in the sense that, yeah, of course our bodies affect how we feel. I mean, hormones, all of us, no matter what your sex or gender is, you have hormone fluctuations. It's not just a menstrual thing, okay? And that's going to affect how you feel about things. And we're always, a lot of our emotional states are tied to physical things that are happening in our bodies, okay? But our cultural environment and our social environment influences us at such a young age that it also has a lot to do with how we feel about things, okay? So the idea then behind the cultural construction of gender is that a person's gender is assigned. You might hear that term sometimes, assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. So your gender is essentially like you go to a hospital, somebody's giving birth, the baby comes out, look between their legs, it's a girl, it's a boy. And again, they're deciding that based on what they perceive, right? Because you're in a society where you have a penis, automatically you're male, you have a vulva, automatically you're female, and it's kind of creating those categories, not taking into account the deeper biology of this, which we'll touch on a bit later. I know some of you are going, okay, Jackie, you've gone nuts. What do you mean? Of course a penis is a boy. Well, it's more complicated than that. More complex, I should say. It's actually not that complicated. When you get over that emotional hurdle of acknowledging that the world isn't the way that you were raised to believe it was. So gender is assigned by culture, and it's based on an interpretation of biology, right? So again, it's based on that interpretation that categorizes people that first glance, their genitals say it all, right? But that's not the case everywhere, right? Because gender ideas vary from culture to culture. So the way in which a gender is assigned by a culture can vary. Now, genital configuration is a pretty common one around the world, but sometimes there's more flexibility. There might be other circumstances that affect how somebody will be assigned gender-wise, or there might be a period where, we know, okay, this person's a girl, but we know that this maybe other things will gain new knowledge about this person later on based on that person's experience of the world. So there's variation here in terms of those interpretations of biology that happen in order to construct gender. So again, when we say cultural construction of gender, we're not saying that It has nothing to do with our bodies. We're just saying that each culture has its own ideas about the link between our bodies, our sex, for lack of a better term like that, and our gender. Okay? So for a lot of cultures, well, the ones that a lot of folks here have grown up with, and Western society, for example, it's a very straightforward connection. You have this body, well, that's your gender. It's not that straight, haha, see what I did there? Forward everywhere. So in terms of gender norms, and we'll talk about the distinction between norms and roles and all that in a moment, but gender norms and roles are learned through socialization and enculturation. You might remember these terms from back in week 2 when we talked about culture and how we learn culture, right? So socialization is that process where you're growing up and you're being taught the rules of interaction, how you're supposed to behave according to who you are. So gender socialization winds up being, oh, okay, you've been assigned this gender. Well, here are the rules for your gender. And it's not always direct instruction. Sometimes there are some comments like, hey, boys don't cry, or girls don't do this, or girls don't climb trees, whatever. But often it's through kind of more subtle things, like being rejected if you are a certain way, you don't meet the expectations for your gender. And enculturation is kind of the ideology that's taught, right? So how do you learn your culture's ideology? And that's involved in learning gender norms and roles as well, because that's kind of integrated in a lot of other kinds of education about, say, sexuality and marriage or politics and whatever. So gender norms and roles, just to clarify here, when we talk about gender norms, we're talking about expectations for behavior, personality, so that can include how do people interact with each other. So often, you might have experienced situations in your life where you weren't sure, you saw a person and you weren't sure what gender they were. And if you're like me and you're part of the queer community, that's no big deal. Because most of us have gotten over that at this point. But, for a lot of people, it's kind of like, oh my God. And when I started teaching, there wasn't a lot of discussion of trans identities, queerness. It was still a very taboo topic. I talked about it anyway because that's how I roll, but at the time I would get a lot of backlash. There was still a lot of homophobia and transphobia, for example. And so when I would talk about, say, gender norm expectations, and I'd ask my class, how do you react if you see somebody and you don't know what their gender is? Well, people were like, they were panicking. They were like, well, I wouldn't even know what to talk about with this person. Because if the person's a woman, I'll talk about some things, and if the person's a man, I'll talk to them about another thing. And I was like, well, what if that person is a woman and they're interested in the things that you think only men are interested in? Well, right? People were like, So, and also there was a whole thing of like, well, if it's a woman, then, I'll be attracted to them or not, like depending on the person's gender. So again, there's assumptions of heterosexuality there. So part of gender norms is also expectations about sexuality, because in a world, not a world, can't call myself there, in a society that expects everybody to be heterosexual, well then yeah, you need to know a person's gender because you're only allowed to be attracted to people of a certain gender. And personality too, right? Expectations around what does it mean to be masculine or feminine. And we're not talking about it much here, but there are in some of those ethnographic examples in the textbook, it's really nice because they talk about certain cultures and how within a culture, and we'll touch on that too, within a culture you might have a set of gender norm expectations about personality, but not everybody will adhere to them to the same extent. You'll always have some people who are really, they'll live up to those stereotypes, and other people who are like, they can take it or leave it. Other people will rebel against them. And I really like, they go into quite some depth in terms of, I think it was Iran, and how men, in the ethnographic study in question, there was a wide variety of ways in which men experienced masculinity. So that not everybody bought into, kind of being like the big tough guy, and that really helps kind of demystify some of the stereotypes that people have, especially about Middle Eastern men. Like here in the West, there's these stereotypes that they all dominate their wives and they all beat their wives, and it's really yucky stereotypes and assumptions. But the anthropologist who's doing this study, and I think it was on, it's been a while, but on artificial reproduction strategies or something like that for people who were infertile. And she met many men who were just defying those stereotypes. So it helps us see that, yeah, there are gender norms in any culture, but not everybody adheres to them. It's like any other kind of norm. We talked about this when we talked about culture too. Not every there's a certain ideal in any culture, and in every culture, you'll have people who will abide by those ideals, and you'll have at the other extreme people who rebel against them. And then there's a whole spectrum of people who will, like, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So it's really important to remember that. When we talk about gender roles, they're similar to norms in the sense of expectations, but it's more about positions in society, like what it is you actually do, what roles you take on. So when we have more time together, I go more into this here, the gender division of labor. Pretty much every culture has a way of, defining, say, women's work and men's work, but it's not always an oppressive thing, right? It's like it's more about, like, well, what value is given. So you have societies where you have women's work and men's work, but they're both equally valued and recognized, and they complement each other. Whereas in the West, the tendency has been women's work is somehow less important, and if men do that, they're going to be seen as like, ooh, and that sort of thing. Reproductive roles, so what, defining motherhood, fatherhood, and things like that. Family roles as spouses and other kinds of relationships, right? So we're really talking about, norms. So how are you as a person? How do you behave? What's your personality? And roles, like, well, what do you actually do? And again, in both these cases, not the same in every culture in the world. It varies from culture to culture. So again, it's not this thing like, where people think sometimes, oh, women have always had this kind of role and men have always had this kind of role. No, we've debunked that in evolutionary terms and also in cross-cultural terms. It varies enormously in terms of, like, well, what is motherhood? What are motherhood and fatherhood supposed to be like? Or what's women's work? What's men's work? Is there flexibility there? And, as I've mentioned a few times, this hasn't been the same since the beginning of time, as a lot of students like to write in their essays. So in terms of cultural variation, every culture, just to kind of recap here a bit of what we've been touching on, every culture in the world has a set of ideas about gender. So, though these ideologies help answer questions such as, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be of another gender identity, if that is present in this culture? Linked question, are there only women and men, or are there other genders, right? Some cultures have 3 or more genders in their ideology. How do different genders interact with each other? So are there relations of domination, or are they equal? And do they have equal voices, right? And responsibilities and things like that? What is the link between these gender norms and roles and biology? So again, as we said before, when we talked about the cultural construction of gender, each culture has its own ideas about what the link is between a person's biological makeup and their gender. And again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, not everybody in a culture agrees on all of this. You'll always have people who go against the grain. That's part of, the beauty of being human. And this is linked to another interesting concept that is covered in the textbook. I keep pointing at it as though you can see what I'm doing, but the textbook is actually here next to me. I'm not lying, okay? So gender performativity. Now, when you first see that term, maybe some of you have seen this term elsewhere. I think sociologists talk about this as well, maybe philosophers, women's studies for sure, women's and gender studies. This isn't, it's kind of misleading, because if you see this, you might think this is all about, like, drag shows, right? Drag queens, drag kings. That's not, there's gender performativity involved in that, but gender performativity is as it's in itself is a concept where everybody, not just performers on a stage, but everybody kind of acts out or performs the gendered scripts that we learn through socialization and enculturation, right? And Anthropologists tried to get away from this idea that, like in chapter 2 when we talked about culture, where culture isn't this monolithic thing that controls your mind completely. Obviously, we grow up, we're socialized, we're enculturated, and so we learn a certain set of ideas and expected behaviors, but it's not like a prison for our mind. Most people kind of go through life, and depending on your position in your society, you have different experiences, and you wind up developing your own worldview. You're not trapped by your cultural mentality. It's just one influence among many. So when it comes to gender socialization and enculturation, it's more that people have these scripts that they learn, and they can use them in different way in different situations, because humans have agency. They can choose between circumstances and, what's the appropriate reaction here, what's keeping me safe, right? And it's, again, linked with the concept of gender socialization. And sometimes people don't like the word socialization because, again, they think that it means that if you're socialized in a certain gender, you're stuck in it. And no, it doesn't mean that we passively absorb these learnings and we're stuck with them. It's just a pressure that we get from society. Another very important concept in this chapter is intersectionality, and especially if we're talking about feminist anthropology or feminist anything, or anything dealing with anti-oppression, it's an important concept that emphasizes multiple aspects of one's identity. This term was coined by, was she a sociologist? I think she was. She is. She's still alive. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black American, I think, professor of sociology, or maybe psychology, one of the social sciences, and she coined this term a couple decades ago to recognize what we said earlier about the feminist movement that was very white, middle class dominated, and go, hey, not all women have the same experiences. So sexism, for example, doesn't affect all women the same way, because people are never just one thing. You're not just your gender, for example. You're not just a woman. You are other things. So all these, there are multiple aspects to anybody's identity, and these different aspects intersect with gender and all the other things that you are. And what that means is that people who share a gender might experience society differently, even though they share a different shared gender. So a bunch of different women will have, different sets of privileges and face different kinds of oppression, depending, for example, on whether they're racialized or whether they're white. Other things like disabilities. If you're a disabled person, you're going to deal with different social challenges, pressures than people who are able-bodied. Language, religion, nationality, like all these things intersect with gender. And again, this doesn't just apply to women, it's men too. All right, so and any other gender. So here's an example. Racialized women will experience things differently and maybe have different needs and requirements from the feminist movement than, say, white women in North America, because racism and sexism and any other kind of oppression interact with each other. They intersect. So in terms of cross-cultural ideas about gender and sex based on ethnographic work by anthropologists, so we've touched on some of these things, but just to be more, clear, there's variation with respect to the acknowledgement of categories beyond female and male. So in some societies you have women and you have men, you have males and females, and there are societies where there's a consideration of other categories of gender. Sex, so again, I kind of alluded to this before, where sex, is seen often as it's simple, it's just a person's biological sex, and it's more complex than that, because there are scholars now who are recognizing that your sex, there's different things involved in our biological makeup that winds up being sexualized or gendered. So there's our anatomy, so our genital configuration, our secondary sex characteristics, having breast or body hair, beards. There are genes and chromosomes are within the genes, right? So at the chromosome level, right, we know, there's XX, there's XY, but there are other configurations of that, right? Or hormones, so the hormone levels, we all have pretty much all the hormones, but there are different levels. And so there's common thinking, if you kind of think there's one box for women and one box for men, that there's a constellation of these traits that go together and that define one's sex. But there's a lot more variation than people have been trained to see in the West in particular. Again, similar to race, where with race, people who believe in these categories, often they'll base themselves on skin color because it's the most apparent thing. Well, when it comes to gender slash sex, often it's you look at somebody and what do they look like? Do they have a beard? Do they have body hair? Do they have breasts? What are their genitals like? What's their voice like? And then, you can put them in one box according to those superficial characteristics. But if you don't dig deeper, then you're missing a lot of information. One thing, and I don't want to use intersexuality as a kind of like scapegoat here, because I have some friends who are intersex activists, and it's not to just kind of use that reality to prove or disprove anything, but it is one example where when you consider the fact that there are people who are born with genitalia that doesn't fit binary expectations, and sometimes there are different combinations of chromosomal makeup and genital configurations. So there are people with, say, XX who wind up having a penis, or vice versa, or different combinations of genitals, internal and external. You can look up intersex realities if you want to know more. There's a lot of information out there, and these folks, this reality has been stigmatized and silenced in the West. For example, there are still non-consensual surgeries because if a baby is born intersex in a lot of Western countries, right here in Montreal, St. Justine's, this has been going on. They'll take the baby and give it an operation to make sure it fits in one of the two commonly accepted sex categories. But this has been happening as long as there have been people. It's not an abnormality, it's something that happens in nature. But depending on the culture you're in, people are going to have different ideas, right? So in the West, it's seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. Maybe in some cultures, it's not a problem, it's just a thing that happens. At this point, it's not like when I started teaching where nobody knew what this meant. You probably have all been exposed to conversations about transgender people, so there are debates. Any of you who are in that community know there are lots of debates. A lot of people tend to use transgender as an umbrella term that includes all people who don't identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth. So the doctor said, it's a boy, but that person grows up at some point in their life. It could be when they're 5, it could be when they're 20, 30, whatever. They figure out, actually, no, I'm not. Right? Or vice versa, or something else entirely. And then there are non-binary identities, and the textbook talks a bit about more. I don't completely agree with how they say things sometimes, but it's good enough if you're new to this, and you might have some problems with it as well if, like me, you're part of the trans and non-binary and queer communities where you're like, it's not perfect, but at least they're talking about it, and they weren't 20 years ago. Whereas non-binary identities are non-binary people are people who identify as something other than female or male, or sometimes both, right? Sometimes something different, entirely different gender. Sometimes it's a bit of a blend, right? Some people put non-binary identities under the transgender umbrella. Some people don't. Some people consider themselves to be both. If we had more time, we could go in more depth in this, and if people have questions, I'm willing to answer these kinds of questions because I have personal experience with this. More on cross-cultural identities about gender and sex. So the terms on the previous slides, intersex, trans, non-binary, they kind of largely emerged in the West, and not all cultures categorize things the same way, so this is where it gets tricky. So for example, in a lot of indigenous cultures here on Turtle Island, what you know as North America, there are many, and I always remind people of this, many indigenous cultures here, okay? Not just one single culture, and each culture has their own word for this. And so Two-Spirit is a contemporary term that people created at some point within that community to kind of unify many different nations and cultures. But each culture does have their own word, and often it's used to refer to people who are seen as having both a female and male spirit. Because here, gender isn't just a biological thing, it's not just a psychological thing, it's also a spiritual thing. So concretely, that could manifest as people who have non-heterosexual orientations, right? Because sexual orientation is different from gender, but they're related in the sense that your gender socialization also tells you who you're supposed to be attracted to, which is why gay and bisexual men have been stereotyped as being effeminate, and lesbian and bisexual women have often been stereotyped as being masculine, which there's a range, right? You can be of any sexual orientation and any gender identity. But in a lot of indigenous societies, like, things were just organized differently. So, sometimes people who today would be referred to as two-spirit had important social and ceremonial roles. So we saw before gender roles, right? Well, that doesn't apply to just women and men. If you have a society that considers that there are other genders, well, then sometimes they're given their own important roles. Now, when it comes to sexuality, meaning in terms of sexual activities that people engage in, who they're attracted to. First of all, it's not in here and it's not in the book, but I do want to affirm that there is such a thing as asexual people, people who don't feel sexual attraction or who feel it only in certain circumstances. This is a legitimate identity. You can look into this if you're a person who's confused and you feel like invisible because you feel maybe like, why don't I feel sexual? It's okay. It's really okay. Look up asexual. Aromantic is a related term. There's a whole community out there that you can plug into. Ask me if you have trouble finding it and you'd like to know more. So as with gender, every culture has its own ideas about what is proper sexuality, right? In the West, there's an assumption that everybody is sexual. Therefore, asexual people often wind up feeling like they don't have a legitimate identity. But there's also this concept of heteronormativity, or the idea that heterosexual intercourse is the only correct form of sexuality, which is related, of course, to homophobia, but they're slightly different, because you can be heteronormative without being homophobic, right? I know, it's a fine line. So not all cultures in the world have been heteronormative. So again, just like patriarchy is not universal, it hasn't existed everywhere in every single culture throughout time, neither has heteronormativity, right? People think that sometimes because they think reproduction is the main drive of humans. And you know what? Not necessarily. The main drive is usually survival and enjoying life and having raising your family, but that doesn't always involve exclusively heterosexual sex, right? It's more complex than that, much more interesting than that. So sexuality has been as fluid as gender in many societies in the world. And what happens today is that if you look around the world, sometimes you will find a lot of patriarchy and a lot of heteronormativity and even a lot of homophobia and transphobia. But a lot of that is that in not the whole world, but large parts of the world have been colonized by Europeans in the last few centuries. And that colonization has helped spread patriarchy and heteronormativity, right? So people actually, like here in North America, Jesuit missionaries came with the French to the East Coast, and same with English. Like, they brought priests and missionaries and all that with them, who were like, in their systems, men were supposed to dominate women, and that's just the way it was, and women only had sex with men, and men only had sex with women, and everything else was an aberration. So when they encountered people here, or when they colonized in Africa or anywhere else where there was more fluidity in a lot of cultures, not every culture, right? Because there's variation. Some societies have been patriarchy, but they would encounter societies that were not sometimes, and they would be like, oh my god, this is horrible, and they would kind of try to convert people to their way of thinking, sometimes successfully. So the effect of heteronormativity in anthropology is similar to the effect of Western male bias in that, again, early anthropologists were mostly white North Americans or Western Europeans, a lot of them men, and even some of the women were still trained in that same way of thinking, and they assumed that behavior that was not heterosexual was an aberration that was only found in the West. Sometimes they didn't even see it existing. It was right under their noses sometimes, or they would do field work, but they would just not acknowledge it or believe that it existed. Or they would impose their own categories of sexuality on other cultures in their interpretation. So they'd hear something going on, but they would make assumptions about what it meant. So affection, physical affection between men, for example, may mean something different in different places, but then they would kind of make their own assumptions. But, in a lot of cultures in the world throughout time and today, people don't necessarily always create an identity based on who they're emotionally or sexually attracted to. So that part is kind of a Western thing in terms of, like, as a reaction to a common oppression, a lot of people of diverse sexualities and genders have created identities based on these their attractions or their genders, but that's because we've been oppressed for so long, so then you form community based on that common oppression. But that is not something that has always existed. So in a lot of places, it doesn't matter who you have sex with. It doesn't have anything to do with your identity. So there's no gay label or that kind of thing. Other variations, so, we've talked about sexual orientation, and the book kind of takes that orientation. Haha, see what I did there? But there are other variations in cultural ideas about sexuality that they don't touch on. For example, privacy concerns. In the West, there's a big deal. It's like if a kid walks in and they interrupt their parents having sex, it's seen as this big traumatic thing for the parents and the kid, and like, oh my god, because sex is something so dirty, right? Well, there are cultures where, maybe before they were colonized and heavily interfered with, maybe if they were small nomadic groups, they'd put up a shelter that lasted just a few weeks. Everybody's sleeping in the same, say, shelter or hut, very close quarters, and yeah, occasionally the parents wake up and have sex in the middle of the night, and maybe once in a while a kid will wake up and see them, and it's just no big deal. The age of sexual experimentation. There are cultures where it's considered normal for kids to sexually experiment with each other, or teens, and they don't have to wait till a certain age. It's not considered taboo, and so you'll have kids playing around, and this is how they're learning about their bodies and what their bodies can do. It might be with people of the same sex or of another sex. It doesn't always matter. Sexuality in marriage. Not all cultures view sexuality as reserved for people who are married. So again, in the West, that's been heavily steeped in Christian traditions, the whole sex before marriage thing was taboo for a long time. Less so today. A lot of people don't really care anymore. Some people do. But that hasn't been the same for all cultures in the world throughout time. So there are places where you're not supposed to wait till you're married, because you want some experience first so that when you get married, you know what you're doing. So last slide here. I know it's been a long thing, but there's so much to talk about, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. This is not in the book either, but I think it's really important to talk about this given what's happening just today, even in the news. Sexual violence and rape culture. Now, sometimes there are people, again, because of those kind of flawed evolutionary ways of thinking where people have false assumptions about how evolution works and what that implies for gender, there are some people who falsely believe that there's something about men that makes them naturally want to go out and rape women. Right? So that sexual violence is somehow an essential part of manhood, and that's bogus, all right? So in non-patriarchal societies, rape and other sexual violence, right? Rape is not the only form of sexual violence. That wouldn't really make sense, because rape is not about pleasure and sexuality, right? It's about power. So if you don't have that inequality, then it winds up not really making sense. Not that it never happens, because again, you have individuals right? And not everybody's the same. But in general, it's not something that really is necessarily common in societies that aren't patriarchal, and it would be something considered very serious. So when we talk about rape culture, then we're talking about these kind of society-wide structures that promote the idea that consent violation is okay. When we talk about rape culture, sometimes people get defensive and they think that we mean that everybody is pro-rape. It's not necessarily that way. It's, again, there are false ideas about rape always happening in a dark alley somewhere, or the woman was looking for it, or that it's only women who get raped, and so on and so forth. But you see it in this system, right? So the courts, when people go to court, there's a tendency to worry more about the rapist's reputation, especially if he's a good-looking young man on a sports team, than about the victim's well-being. And that's things like that, and again, the whole kind of downplay of the importance of consent. So you can read more about what this means and maybe not get so defensive about it. But it's very something d'actualité. There's a lot of talk about violence right now, domestic violence, sexual violence. So I just put here these last few slides. You can look at them when you download the PowerPoint. There's some resources at Vanier and elsewhere. So if you're in distress, you've survived any kind of sexual assault or witnessed it, or you're questioning your gender or your orientation, or you're being bullied and harassed in any way, there are a whole bunch of resources here that you can access. If you have trouble accessing any of them, please feel free to talk to me. I'm openly queer and trans and have been for a long time at Vanier, and I'm always willing to help students access the resources that they need. Obviously not just students who are queer or trans, but anybody who needs any kind of support. Maybe you have somebody in your family that's having a hard time, and so there are resources, and again, always happy to help connect you with the resources that you need.